a lot of people study the Bible. A lot of people love the Bible, but they don't really connect it to the land of Israel. Now, I have a question for you. Now, since you've been here, 10 days now? Okay, so you're experts. That's good. How did the promised land, the land of Israel, become the Holy Land? And most of us don't even think much about that. That's fine how we use that term, isn't it? The Holy Land. But usually people mean it today. Not always, but because sometimes they're unaware of it. But they use the word the Holy Land in distinction from the land of Israel, the land connected to the Jewish people. Well, how did that happen? Does anybody know, just out of curiosity? If you take the tour guiding course in Israel, you'll learn this. But in what happened in the 4th century, Constantine, right, makes the Roman Empire Christian, and voila, everything now is Christian, and his mother comes to the promised land, the land of Israel, and begins to Christianize these sites, and it becomes the Holy Land. And so that's how people tend to think of it today. But that is not really a true understanding of the land of Israel. And so, briefly, I want to show you one example. I want to connect theology, I want to connect geology, and geopolitics. I'm going to do all that in like 15 minutes. So here goes. All right, well, so you can see this picture I have up here, and I kind of like this picture of Matthew. He looks kind of Jewish, a little bit, but still it's a little bit churchy. And yet this is what people think of when they think of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, that's fine, because I said he's got a kind of a Jewish face, although I would encourage you to think of mine a little bit more. But when you think of the land of Israel, this is what, or the Gospel of Matthew, this is what I want you to think of. What is this? Do you know?
Looking, I think he's on Galilee.
Sea of Galilee. And what is that mountain, by the way? It's a little dark in here, but can you see it? It's the Arbel Mountain, which is my favorite site. And down at the base, sort of, you'd see Magdala down there. And I'll leave that for Angela to tie the loose ends for you. But when you think of the Gospel of Matthew, I want you to think about, and Luda, his wonderful wife, I should not forget that. When you think of the Gospel of Matthew, you need to think of not just the land of Israel, but the Galilee, because this is the heart of this story. Now, when we look at the political borders in the time of Israel, you can see, and you're probably somewhat familiar with these already, you have these very distinct areas, Samaria, Judea below, and Galilee ruled by Antipas, who of course gave Jesus so much trouble. And this is where this story of the Gospel of Matthew is unfolds. Now, when you read the Gospels, where does most of it take place? In the Galilee, right. But when we read Luke and when we read Mark, we see Jesus moving quite a bit, don't we? Back and forth, especially in Luke. That's what I was really thinking of. John moving back and forth. But in Matthew, where do we see Jesus?
Wandering around the lake.
That's right, wandering around the lake. In fact, we see him all the time in Galilee, except for the final week of his ministry when he goes to take care of business in Jerusalem. And if you were to sort of outline the Gospel of Matthew, this is what you'd see. So to give full credit, I stole this outline from my friend Joel Willett. I actually modified it, but he was the inspiration of the Gospel. But this is the sort of representation of the outline of the Gospel. You know, people, theologians and scholars and academics sit around all day discussing how books should be outlined. They never read it or apply it. They just try to figure out, well, where's first chapter begin? But this is the one that I think is the most accurate and I choose to embrace and unpack because I think it reflects the heart of the story. And if you had a semester, I would do that for you, but we only have a few more minutes left. Well, in chapter 1 through chapter 4, verse 11, you have the introduction, which is jam-packed with information. And we'll look at that a little bit, but not primarily. But the heart of this story is from chapter 4, verse 12, to chapter 18, verse 35, where you have the story of the Messiah King's activity in Galilee and its environ. The entire Gospel of Matthew unfolds in the Galilee. Why? Because Jesus, Yeshua, is on a mission to rescue the Galilee, to claim the Galilee, to restore the Galilee. This is a place of messianic expectation. And I would add, not only in the New Testament gospel, but in extra biblical Jewish texts as well, you see this emphasis on the messianic context of the Galilee. And so this is the heart of the story. And if you don't understand that, you miss the point of Matthew's gospel. Now, as I said, in chapter 19 through chapter 28, verse 15, you have Yeshua's return to Judea and Jerusalem, where he fulfills his messianic responsibilities, and the Passion Week unfolds, and that's a story in and of itself. But what happens after that event is accomplished is Yeshua says to his disciples what? When I rise from the dead, where will he meet you? Where will I meet you? In the Galilee, right? I'm going back to the Galilee and I want you there. Why? Because I have another mission for you. And so in chapter 28, verses 16 through 28, usually there's this emphasis on this phrase, the Great Commission, and that's where people let it lie. But there's that, but so much more. Why is there a Great Commission? Because Yeshua has finished his messianic task of redeeming Israel. Now, the project isn't done in the sense that a whole lot of history will unfold first, but he died and rose again, and he had secured the fate of the nation of Israel and God's kingdom, and then he sends his disciples on their mission to preach and proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles. Now that's the big overview. I want to give you some, I want to dig down very quickly into some specific points. How long do I have? I lost track. I can't hear you. So, okay, 8 minutes? You're kidding me. Okay, this is going to be the fastest. Oh, 18 minutes. That's what I thought he meant. Okay, so, all right, I'll do this very quickly. Well, if you look in chapter 4, verses 12 through 17, and you can chat about this on your own, and I'll be happy to share with you my email address and answer any questions that we don't cover in the next 8 minutes. But in chapters 12 through 17, you have this account of Jesus' arrival in the Galilee. Now, we won't well, let's look at, we can spare 8 minutes, can't we? Somewhere in there. Look at Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 17. Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, 12 through 17, and we read, when Yeshua heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. You know, people say that these geographical references are just sort of minor details to move the story along. They're certainly moving the story along, but they are anything but minor details. They are packed with significance. He withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali. There you have a reference to the two tribes. And then you have what we refer to as a fulfillment citation, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. The land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, or Galilee of the nations. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land, the shadow of death, a light has dawned. All right, so what do you have here? You have in this section a couple important details. So you have this statement in verses 12 through 14 that when Yeshua heard of John the Baptist's arrest, he left Nazareth and he moved to the territory of Galilee. And he makes a statement. And then you have amended to that. Well, so here's sort of a visual you can see of that. And by the way, I know you have this, whoops, where did I lose it? You have this lovely map, thank you, that's what I was looking for. And so look at the distance that you have. Most of this activity takes place, of course, in Israel's history in Jerusalem, but everything's happening centered here. So Jesus moves from Nazareth to Galilee. Why does he want us to focus on that detail so much? All right, I really wanted to plug the map. What's the connection to... Now, do you see Nazareth? You can barely see it there, but it's in the region of Zebulun, and then he moved to Naphtali. And so you have this connection. Why is Matthew putting this stress on the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali? Where do we see them last in history? Anybody know? This is a trick question that I would do to my students, but I'll just give it to you because I've got a minute left. But when Israel went into captivity, what were the first two tribes go into captivity to be sacked? That's right. The tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali were the first two tribes to fall to foreign invasion, and they were carried off in exile. And that's where the destruction of the kingdom begins, in these two tribes. So what Matthew is pointing us to is he wants us to see the place where Israel's collapse began will be what? It will be the place where Israel's restoration begins. And so you have, again, this technical term, this technical formula where he quotes Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 and 2 about the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. And so what I want you to think of when you read this passage next time is the Galilean shoreline. Because this is the vision, I think, that Matthew is casting for us of the messianic reclamation of the land of Israel. Of course, I don't have time to go into it now, but in Matthew, it is a battle pitted not between men and demons, but between God and the devil, God and demons. And the land is currently under the dominion of the powers of Satan. And it is being reclaimed and claimed to become a part of the restored kingdom of heaven. If we had more time to talk about it, we'd see that the kingdom of heaven is talking about God's dominion, not only over the heavens, but over the land. So this is the battle that's unfolding in this gospel, this battle between Satan, who has claimed dominion over the land of Israel because of Israel's sin, and the Messiah of Israel, who's come to knock him out and to reclaim the land of Israel. And that's what we see unfolding in this story. This really kind of gets you pumped up, doesn't it? Gets me working. Amen. So what is this? Does anybody remember what this is? You're seeing it, right? This is the synagogue at Capernaum. And unfortunately, it's a little dark on the screen. But below it, you have the base. Now, there's a lot of debate today about whether that base was the earlier synagogue. The synagogue on top, the limestone one, is from the Byzantine era, the 5th century. But I believe, I'm persuaded, that the structure below it is in fact the synagogue that Jesus preached in when he was in the Galilee. And so, you can imagine, one time I was there giving a similar discussion, sitting on those benches, looking at the synagogue, talking about the very synagogue below where Yeshua taught in and proclaimed the kingdom's arrival. But this is the connection. So when you think about the political borders of the land of Israel, what is Jesus doing? What is Yeshua doing? He is marching through the land of Israel. Everywhere he goes, every miracle he's performing, what's he doing? He's reclaiming the land of Israel, denying Satan's right to that territory. And so when Yeshua arrives in Galilee and departs from Nazareth, Matthew makes a declaration that this occurred in fulfillment of Isaiah 9, verses 1 and 2. The land of Zebulun, the territory, have seen a great light. They were sitting in darkness. Why were they in darkness? Because they were in exile, both physical and spiritual. And now that the Messiah has arrived, they are no longer in darkness. Why? Because through his power of the forgiving of sin, he is restoring them to the kingdom and the land of Israel. This place that you're in today, that you've enjoyed and traveled through, is being reclaimed for the kingdom of heaven. And on that high note, I'm going to quit. So thank you and shalom.